The rain hammered against the tall windows of Caldwell Hall like 1,000 angry fists. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers blazed with merciless light. Hundreds of the ton's finest stood frozen in their silk and velvet champagne glasses halfway to their lips. And in the center of it all, Duke Ethan Caldwell stood alone. His broad shoulders were rigid beneath the perfectly tailored black evening coat. His gray eyes, usually so calm and commanding, now burned with raw disbelief. Lord Marcus Hale's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I accuse you, Duke Ethan Caldwell, of poisoning your own father to steal the title that was never truly yours." A collective gasp ripped through the room. Marcus stepped forward, holding up a folded letter with dramatic flair. "Here is the proof, a letter in your father's own hand, and the sworn testimony of a trusted servant who saw everything." Whispers exploded into a storm. "He did what poisoned his own blood." "Monster!" Ethan's face drained of color, his knuckles turned white around the stem of his glass. For one terrible heartbeat, he looked like a man who had just been shot through the heart. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died before they could form. Every pair of eyes that once respected him now stared with horror, or worse, cold judgment. Then from the shadows near the service door, a young woman in a simple gray uniform stood trembling. Ava Reed. Her tray of champagne flutes shook in her hands. She had only stepped into the servants' hallway for a moment to catch her breath, and overheard everything. She had heard Lord Marcus Hale whispering to his wife, Lady Sophia Hale, in the dark corridor. The old man never suspected a thing. "I mixed the powder myself. By morning he was gone, and the title is finally ours." Ava's heart pounded so violently she could barely breathe. She knew what would happen if she spoke. She would lose everything, her position, her brother Tyler's future, perhaps even her freedom. But the lie was too monstrous to swallow. The room was still roaring with accusation when Ava set her tray down with a soft clink. She stepped forward, one step, then another. The sea of silk and jewels parted in shock as this insignificant maid walked straight into the heart of the ballroom. Every head turned. Duke Ethan Caldwell's gaze locked onto her, confused, wary, almost warning. Ava's voice trembled, but it carried clearly through the stunned silence. I heard Lord Hale say it himself." The entire room went deathly quiet. "He told Lady Sophia that he mixed the powder with his own hands, that the old Duke never suspected anything, and that the title would finally be his." For 3 full seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Ethan stared at Ava as if she were a miracle and a catastrophe at the same time. A flicker of something desperate, something almost like hope, flashed across his face before he could hide it. Then chaos erupted. "How dare you!" Lady Sophia Hale shrieked. "Remove that insolent girl at once!" Marcus roared, his face twisting with fury. 2 footmen lunged forward and seized Ava by the arms. She didn't fight them. She only looked back once, straight at Ethan. Their eyes met for a single searing moment. In that look, Ethan saw fear. He saw courage so fierce it terrified him. And beneath it all, he saw the terrifying truth that someone finally had dared to speak for him. The footman dragged Ava toward the side door as the ballroom exploded with outrage and disbelief. Ladies clutched their pearls. Gentlemen muttered in scandalized tones. Ethan remained rooted in place, completely alone now. The people who had smiled at him only minutes ago turned their backs. The music faltered. The lights seemed to dim. He was no longer the respected Duke of Caldwell. He was the accused. He was the monster. And somewhere beyond those slamming doors, a young maid named Ava Reed had just destroyed her entire world for a man she barely knew. Because in that moment she chose truth over safety, and that single choice changed everything. The heavy oak door of Caldwell Hall slammed shut behind Ava Reed with a finality that echoed through her bones. Rain still poured from the night sky as two footmen shoved her into the muddy courtyard. Her thin gray uniform was already soaked through. "You're finished here, girl," one of them growled. "Lord Hale says no house in London will take you after tonight. Not even the lowest tavern." Ava stood there, trembling fists clenched at her sides. She thought of her little brother Tyler waiting for her in the servants' quarters. She thought of the small room they shared, the few coins she had saved for his apprenticeship. Everything gone in a single heartbeat. By morning, Tyler was thrown out as well. The boy stood beside her on the wet cobblestones, his young face pale with confusion and fear. "What did we do wrong, Ava?" he whispered. She pulled him close, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Nothing," she said softly. "We did nothing wrong." Inside the great house, the silence was even colder. Duke Ethan Caldwell walked the long corridors alone. The servants who once bowed deeply now lowered their eyes and hurried past him. Whispers followed him like shadows. The poisoned Duke, murderer. Even Mr. Grant, his loyal valet of 15 years, could not quite meet his gaze. Letters arrived by the dozen. Some were formal, others cruel. All of them ended the same way: old friends, distant relatives, even business partners. They wanted nothing more to do with him. Newspapers screamed the scandal from every street corner. The poisoned Duke, a noble monster among us. Ethan sat in his study that first night, staring at the dying fire. The accusations burned hotter than any flame. He had trusted the name Caldwell. He had believed blood meant loyalty. Now that belief lay shattered at his feet. How had he been so blind? Meanwhile, 2 miles away in a cramped boarding house, Ava could not sleep. She kept seeing the Duke's face in that frozen moment. The shock, the flicker of desperate hope. She kept hearing Marcus's whispered confession in the dark hallway. She knew she should stay silent. She had already lost everything. But the truth refused to let her rest. The next afternoon, under a gray sky, Ava slipped through the back streets of London and found Dr. Samuel Whitaker at his modest clinic. The old doctor looked at her with kind but weary eyes. He had served the late Duke for decades. When Ava told him what she had heard, the doctor closed the door, poured 2 cups of weak tea, and spoke in a low voice. "Your father did not die of poison. Your Grace," he had once told Ethan years ago. Now he repeated those words to Ava. It was his heart, a weakness he carried for years. "I warned him many times. There was never any poison." Each new fragment made the picture clearer and more terrifying. Marcus's web reached farther than they imagined. Back at Caldwell Hall, the nights grew longer and heavier. Ethan stood alone in the grand library, the room that once brought him peace. Rain lashed the tall windows. The fire had burned low. He poured himself a glass of brandy, then another. His reflection in the dark glass stared back at him. A man who had once commanded respect, now reduced to a ghost in his own home. Memories flooded in. His father's proud smile, the weight of the title placed on his shoulders, the quiet promise he had made to uphold the family honor. He had trusted too much, seen too little. With a sudden cry of rage and pain, Ethan hurled the glass into the fireplace. It shattered in a burst of flame and sparkling shards. He sank into the leather chair, head in his hands. "Maybe they're right," he whispered into the empty room, voice cracking. "Maybe I do deserve this isolation outside." Hidden in the shadows of the garden, Ava stood motionless under the pouring rain. She had come hoping for, she wasn't even sure what. A chance to tell him what she had learned, a sign that her sacrifice had meant something. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched him. She saw the broken glass. She saw the way his shoulders trembled. She saw a powerful man crumbling under the weight of betrayal and loneliness. Her heart ached with a pain she had no right to feel. She wanted to run inside, to tell him the truth, to say that he was not alone. But the doors were locked. The walls were too high, and her own future hung by the thinnest thread. So she remained there soaked to the skin, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks, watching, waiting, hoping that somewhere inside that cold, silent house, a spark of fight still remained in the man she had risked everything to defend. The invitation came under a false name. Ava Reed smoothed the borrowed maid's uniform over her trembling hands and slipped through the servants' entrance of Caldwell Hall once more. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. She told herself it was only for one night, a small private dinner hosted by Lord Marcus Hale to celebrate his rising influence. No one would notice one extra girl carrying trays and keeping her head down, but she was not here to serve. In the dimly lit pantry behind the ballroom, Dr. Samuel Whitaker waited for her, pretending to examine a tray of medicines for an elderly guest. Their eyes met for only a second. Without a word, he pressed a folded paper into her palm, the late Duke's original medical report written in his own steady hand. Ava hid it quickly inside her sleeve, her fingers icy with fear. She moved through the crowded rooms like a ghost tray, balanced perfectly, eyes lowered. Yet every time she passed a mirror, she caught a glimpse of her own pale face and wondered how long her luck would last. Then she saw him. Duke Ethan Caldwell stood near the far fireplace, dressed in formal black, listening politely to guests who barely looked at him. His posture was stiff, his jaw tight. He looked thinner, older. The loneliness around him was almost visible, like a cold mist no one else seemed to notice. Ava's breath caught. She had not planned to speak to him, not tonight, but fate had other plans. Later, while carrying empty glasses down a narrow servants' corridor, she turned a corner too quickly and nearly collided with a tall figure. Strong hands caught her arms to steady her. She looked up, straight into Ethan Caldwell's storm-gray eyes. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "You," he whispered, voice rough with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Ava's mouth went dry. She should have lied. She should have run. Instead, the words tumbled out in a shaky rush. "I had to come back to Your Grace. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I met Dr. Whitaker, your father. He died of a weak heart. There was never any poison. Lord Marcus, he planned everything." Ethan's grip on her arms tightened, then slowly loosened. He glanced over his shoulder, then pulled her deeper into the shadowed hallway, away from prying eyes. His breathing was uneven. "I trusted him," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Marcus grew up in this house. He called my father uncle. I thought blood meant something. I was arrogant, blind. I let pride keep me from seeing what was right in front of me." Ava looked up at him, her voice soft but steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "You're not alone in this anymore, Your Grace. Not if you don't want to be." For the first time in weeks, Ethan allowed himself to truly see the young woman standing before him, not as a servant, not as a risk, but as someone who had risked her entire life simply because she believed the truth mattered. The moment stretched between them, fragile and electric. Then footsteps echoed at the end of the corridor. Marcus Hale's voice sliced through the air like a whip. "Harlan, find that girl and remove her immediately, and make sure her brother pays for her foolishness." Mr. Harlan, the butler, appeared with two burly footmen. His face was pale, but determined. Ava's blood turned to ice. She tried to step back, but Ethan instinctively moved half a step in front of her. Marcus rounded the corner, his eyes narrowing with cold fury when he saw them together. "So this is where the traitor has been hiding," he snarled. "Take her! And if she speaks one more word, ensure that boy Tyler never sees another sunrise." Ava's stomach dropped. Tyler. Her only family. The footman lunged forward. She turned to run, but the corridor was narrow and their hands were already reaching for her. Suddenly, a strong arm pulled her sideways through a hidden side door she hadn't noticed. Viscount Lucas Black, Ethan's old friend, tall and quietly commanding, pressed a finger to his lips and guided her swiftly down a dark servant's staircase. "Keep moving," he whispered urgently. "Marcus's men are everywhere tonight." They burst out into the rainy night through a back gate. Ava's legs nearly gave out as she stumbled onto the wet cobblestones. Lucas looked back toward the house, his face grim. "Tell Ethan I'll stand with him when the time comes, but for now, stay alive, Miss Reed." Ava nodded, breathless tears of fear and relief mixing with the rain on her cheeks. Inside Caldwell Hall, the dinner continued as if nothing had happened, but in the privacy of his dressing room, Duke Ethan Caldwell stood alone before the tall mirror. The candlelight flickered across his face, highlighting the new lines of exhaustion and doubt. He stared at his own reflection for a long time. He remembered Ava's frightened but determined eyes in that dark hallway. He remembered the way her voice had trembled yet refused to break. He remembered how she had risked her brother's life. For him. His hands clenched at his sides. If a maid, a girl with nothing but courage, is willing to lose everything for the sake of justice, he whispered to the man in the mirror, then what in God's name am I still afraid of? The question hung in the quiet room, heavy with possibility. And for the first time since the night of the accusation, something inside Ethan Caldwell, something long buried beneath pride and pain, began to stir. A spark, a decision, a quiet, dangerous resolve. The grand library of Caldwell Hall had never felt so small. Heavy velvet curtains blocked the afternoon light, leaving only the glow of oil lamps and the crackle of the fireplace to illuminate the tense gathering. Sir Reginald Thorpe sat at the head of the long oak table, his face carefully neutral, as he presided over the closed hearing. Lord Marcus Hale stood tall, radiating confidence. His voice rang with righteous anger as he placed a final document before the small group of witnesses and lawyers. "This is the last piece of evidence," Marcus declared, his eyes gleaming. A letter from the late Duke himself expressing fear for his life, written only days before his death. Combined with the sworn statements I have already presented, there can be no doubt. Duke Ethan Caldwell poisoned his own father to seize the title. I ask this hearing to freeze all assets and strip him of his authority immediately. The air grew thick. Several heads nodded in grim agreement. A few glanced at Ethan with open disgust. Ethan sat at the opposite end of the table, his hands resting on the polished wood. His face was pale, but his jaw was set. He had barely slept since that night in front of the mirror, the weight of weeks of isolation pressed down on him like stones. Marcus leaned forward, sensing victory. The poisoned Duke must be stopped before he destroys this family completely. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the side door opened with a soft click. Every head turned. Ava Reed stepped into the room wearing a simple dark blue dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. She carried no tray this time. She carried truth. Sir Reginald Thorpe frowned. "This is a private hearing. You have no place here, girl." Ava lifted her chin, though her voice shook slightly. "I have every place here. As a witness." She walked slowly toward the table and placed 2 documents before Sir Reginald with steady fingers. The first was an old medical report in the late Duke's doctor's handwriting, Dr. Samuel Whitaker's careful script detailing a long-standing heart condition. The second was a signed statement dated years earlier, in Sir Reginald Thorpe's own hand, admitting that Lord Marcus Hale had paid him a large sum to help reinterpret certain facts surrounding the old Duke's death. The room fell into a silence so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like thunder. Marcus's face drained of all color. Ethan slowly rose from his chair. His gray eyes burned as he looked directly at his cousin for the first time in months. "Marcus," he said, his voice low, but carrying the quiet strength of a man who had finally found his footing, "did you really believe I would never learn the truth? Did you think money and lies could erase blood or conscience?" Marcus opened his mouth, searching desperately for words. This is forgery," he stammered. "The girl is lying. She's nothing but a disgruntled servant trying to—" Before he could finish, the main doors opened again. Lydia Beaumont entered first, followed closely by Viscount Lucas Black. Behind them came two additional witnesses, a former footman Marcus had bribed, and an old housekeeper who had seen money change hands in the servants' quarters. Lydia's voice was clear and steady as she spoke. "We all heard Lord Hale boasting about how the title would soon be his. We stayed quiet out of fear. Until now." Viscount Lucas Black placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder in silent support. Marcus's eyes darted wildly from face to face. His carefully built empire of deception was crumbling before him. The panic in his expression was raw, ugly, and very human. "You can't do this," he shouted, voice cracking. "I am the rightful heir." Two constables who had been waiting outside stepped forward on Sir Reginald's quiet signal. They took Marcus by the arms. As they led him toward the door, the room filled with stunned whispers and murmurs of disbelief. Marcus twisted one last time to glare at Ava. You insignificant little..." The door closed behind him, cutting off the rest of his words. The silence that remained was different now. It carried the weight of justice finally breaking through. Ethan stood motionless for a moment, then turned his gaze across the room. His eyes found Ava. She stood near the end of the table, breathing shallow, her hands still clasped tightly. The courage that had carried her this far was still burning in her eyes, but beneath it he could see exhaustion and something vulnerable. Their eyes locked. In that single look, everything unspoken passed between them, gratitude deeper than words, respect that crossed every boundary of class, and a powerful emotion Ethan had never allowed himself to feel before, a warmth, a pull, a quiet recognition of the woman who had risked her life and her brother's future simply because she believed he deserved the truth. Ava's cheeks flushed slightly under his gaze, but she did not look away. Sir Reginald cleared his throat, visibly shaken. "The hearing is concluded in favor of Duke Ethan Caldwell." As the others began to file out, whispering among themselves, Ethan remained standing. He watched Marcus being led away down the long corridor, the once proud man now reduced to protests and threats that grew fainter with every step. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, then whispered to himself so softly that only the flickering lamplight seemed to hear. "The truth doesn't need a title to shine." Spring sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Caldwell Hall, softening the edges of the great house that had known too much darkness. Lord Marcus Hale and Lady Sophia Hale were gone. Their belongings had been packed and removed quietly under the watchful eyes of the staff. The heavy silence that once clung to every corridor began to lift, replaced by the soft sounds of normal life, returning footsteps with purpose, quiet conversations, and the occasional careful laugh. Duke Ethan Caldwell stood in the entrance hall on a mild afternoon, watching the last carriage disappear down the long drive. He drew in a slow breath as if tasting freedom for the first time in months. The healing had begun. A few weeks later, in the smaller rose garden behind the house, Ethan hosted a modest gathering. Not the grand balls of the past, but an intimate afternoon tea for the household staff and a handful of loyal friends. The air smelled of blooming roses and fresh-cut grass. He stood before them all tall and composed, though his hands betrayed a slight tremor as he spoke. "I owe a debt I can never fully repay," he said, his voice steady but warm. His gray eyes found Ava Reed where she stood near the back, dressed in a simple yet elegant gown of soft blue. "Miss Ava Reed, you stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. You risked your position, your safety, and your brother's future, because you believed the truth mattered more than fear. Today, I thank you publicly in front of everyone here. You reminded me that real dignity is not found in bloodlines or titles. It lives in the courage of those who choose to stand for what is right." A soft ripple of applause moved through the small crowd. Some servants wiped their eyes. Lydia Beaumont smiled proudly beside her friend. Ethan continued, turning slightly toward the young man standing nervously nearby. "Tyler Reed, your sister's bravery has not gone unnoticed. From this day forward, you will begin your formal apprenticeship with Mr. Donovan the silversmith. All expenses will be covered. You have a secure future here as long as you wish it." Tyler's eyes widened. He bowed deeply, voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Your Grace." Later that same afternoon, as the guests slowly departed, Ethan found Ava walking alone among the rose bushes. The late sunlight painted the garden in hues of gold and soft pink. The flowers were in full bloom, their fragrance heavy and sweet. He approached her slowly, his steps measured the old limp from an earlier injury, barely noticeable now. "Miss Reed, Ava," he said quietly when he reached her side. She turned her cheeks, coloring slightly at the sound of her given name on his lips. For a moment the old boundaries flickered between them, servant and master, commoner and duke. But neither of them reached for those walls anymore. "I asked you to stay," he continued, his voice low and sincere, "not as a servant, but as the manager of my library and my personal advisor. The position has never been offered to someone of your background before. It may bring gossip. It may bring disapproval from those who still cling to old ways, but I want you here because I trust you, because I see you." Ava looked down at the roses for a long moment, her fingers brushing lightly over a velvet petal. Memories flooded her, the rainy night she had spoken out, the fear in the hallway, the long days of uncertainty. The moment she had placed those documents on the table and changed everything. She lifted her gaze to meet his. "I accept," she whispered. "Not because I need protection, but because I believe in what we're building here." They walked together along the gravel path in comfortable silence. The weight of the past week still lingered, but it no longer crushed them. It had become something shared, something that had forged a deeper understanding between two souls who should never have crossed paths. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long golden shadows across the garden, Ethan stopped beneath an archway heavy with climbing roses. He turned to face her fully. For a heartbeat, hesitation flickered in his eyes, the old fear of crossing lines, the memory of isolation, the vulnerability of opening his heart after so much betrayal. Then he extended his hand, not for support, not out of need, but as an equal invitation. Ava looked at his open palm. Her breath caught. She knew what this gesture meant. It was quiet. It was dangerous in the eyes of society, and it was profoundly real. Slowly, she placed her hand in his, their fingers intertwined gently. The touch was warm, steady, and full of unspoken promises. No grand declaration, no dramatic kiss. Just two people standing together in a garden, choosing connection over convention. In that quiet moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. Ethan's thumb brushed lightly over her knuckles, a small gesture filled with tenderness he had never allowed himself to show before. Ava smiled softly, her eyes shining with quiet joy and a touch of wonder. As the last light of day painted the sky in soft lavenders and golds, the two of them remained there, hands joined, hearts quietly aligning. In a world bound by rigid rules and unforgiving hierarchies, sometimes all it takes is one brave voice speaking the truth to change an entire castle. And real dignity, the kind that cannot be bought or inherited, always belongs to those who choose justice even when the price is highest. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. We appreciate you more than you think. If this tale stirred something deep inside, we invite you to remain part of this frontier of memories. More true stories of honor, compassion, and destiny are waiting for you here. Subscribe, share, comment, and thank you for writing with us today. Aviso legal barra disclaimer. Our content is designed for artistic and entertainment purposes and may reinterpret historical themes using fictional touches. We apply AI tools thoughtfully only to support production while keeping human supervision over editing, emotional tone, and narrative coherence. We always comply with regulatory guidelines for AI-based media and avoid deepfake practices or identity manipulation. All supporting components remain legally sourced. Please ask for authorization before sharing or adapting any segment. Your respect makes it possible for us to continue telling meaningful stories.